In the age of the internet, it is now easier than ever to find information on films and filmmaking that would have otherwise been unavailable to anyone not in film school. In fact, I try to dedicate part of my channel to teaching important filmmaking techniques as my way of giving back to the community that helped me get to the point where I get to work on films for a living. Hi, my name's Neo, and I'm a filmmaker. A filmmaker that never went to film school. And while that was entirely my own decision, part of why I didn't go was just because of how inaccessible film school can actually be for younger people that live in America. Not only is film school expensive, but having a degree doesn't guarantee you that you'll ever work in the industry, just like how not having a degree doesn't guarantee you that you won't either. I, like many other filmmakers, learned everything that I know from talking to people that were working in the industry that were willing to teach me. And growing up in the early 2000s gave me the advantage of using the internet, where I could go onto websites like cinematography.com and other forums and interact with people that actually worked in the industry and ask them questions. But nowadays there's YouTube, and YouTube is practically built for tutorials, how-tos, and masterclasses. So naturally, filmmakers all across the world would grow to use this platform to try and share their filmmaking knowledge with those that were eager to learn. However, one problem that has always existed when it comes to finding information on the internet is that not everyone knows what they're talking about, and sooner or later you will be misinformed. And as with any community, the filmmaking community has quite a few people that are guilty of doing this. Let's start with something that almost every filmmaker here on YouTube messes up, and that's camera reviews and recommendations. As a general rule of thumb, I don't really take camera reviews that seriously. I mean, unless they're reviewing something like a $10,000 cinema camera. Because if they're just talking about some dinky little DSLR or mirrorless camera, then I'd be much better off just finding a place where I can rent the camera and try it out for myself, rather than listen to someone read off a spec sheet and throw pretty B-roll and test footage over top of it. On top of that, I rarely see any filmmakers talk about cameras that actually interest me, or cameras that might interest younger filmmakers that might not know as much. Take for example the Panasonic G7. Back in 2017, this 4K mirrorless camera was being talked about by every filmmaker on YouTube because of its incredibly low $500 price tag, and it was only one-upped by its more beefed up older brother, the GH4. But now that the GH5 and the GH5S have dropped, so is the price for the GH4. Now you can basically find these two cameras used for around the same price. Meaning that everyone who bought this camera because of the hype surrounding it would have been better off just waiting for the release of the GH5 and getting a GH4 once the price went down. Now, I'd normally say that whatever camera a director uses is their choice and no one should really have much of a say in the matter, but a lot of people on YouTube started calling the Panasonic G7 the best camera for beginner filmmakers. And not only do I disagree entirely, but I bet a lot of younger filmmakers wasted their money on this thing that they didn't even really need in the first place, only to have it pretty much be obsolete 3 years later. I've worked as a freelancer for several years now, and I almost never film anything in 4K, for a multitude of reasons. Not only do most clients not request 4K footage or even really understand what 4K is, but just because a 4K camera costs less than $1,000, that doesn't mean that shooting in 4K is going to be cheap. For one thing, you're going to need a PC that's capable of handling 4K footage, and while this isn't exactly difficult to do if you're somebody that works in media production full time, it can not only be very difficult for someone that's just trying to get their foot in the door, but it can also be economically unsound because in order to offset the cost of better equipment, you now have to charge more money, which as a beginner isn't wise because your skills aren't worth that much yet. So you're gonna find far less clients that want to spend the extra cash just for 4K footage. Most people would rather just pay for 1080p footage that was done by someone with a lot more experience. On top of that, the Panasonic G7 just doesn't look good. The Micro Four Thirds sensor is too small to produce high quality cinematic footage, and even with the 4K quality, it's a lot harder to get the shallow depth of field and sharpness that is most commonly associated with cinema. This is why most films are shot on Super 35 sensors or bigger. If I had to recommend a better camera for beginner filmmakers, I'd probably pick the Canon T3i. This camera came out in 2011 and footage from it still holds up to this day. The APS-C sensor is a lot bigger than the Micro Four Thirds found in the Panasonic G7, and there's a huge market of used lenses and accessories that you can get for very little money. This is largely due to the fact that Canon's EF mount is one of the most common mounts that companies manufacture lenses for. An entire set of Rokinon Cine Primes will only set you back about $1,200 and will produce footage that not only looks cinematic, but will actually get you paid as well. Now, of course, this camera lacks certain features like continuous autofocus, touchscreen menus, and back button focusing, but these are all features that are missing from most professional cinema cameras anyway. Filmmakers don't rely on these things to create good-looking footage. This is exactly what I said in a comment that I left on D4 Darius's video about the Panasonic G7. D4 Darius is a filmmaker that I've been subscribed to for quite some time. His videos are not only informative, but he has a style, charm, and energy that can't be matched. He talks about film in a very passionate way, and you can tell that hustle is one of his core elements when it comes to filmmaking. There are, however, a few things about his channel that I just don't like that much. Mainly his gear videos. Now this isn't exactly exclusive to D4 Darius. I mean, I don't really like when any filmmaking channel does gear review videos, unless they're talking about industry standard film gear that most indie people wouldn't be that familiar with. This is because I think that a lot of the gear that these channels tend to talk about isn't really that useful to indie filmmakers. Some of the gear that Darius has discussed on his channel includes anamorphic lenses, wireless lav mics, sliders, audio recorders, tripods, and camera bags. And while I'd say that he does a good job at discussing these things in great detail, only a few of these are actually applicable to beginner filmmakers, which is what the majority of his audience consists of. Not to mention, I think his videos discussing filmmaking techniques are actually far more useful. I'd like to see him discuss gear that would be more relevant to beginner filmmakers, since most beginners aren't going to have access to things like anamorphic lenses or wireless lav mics. But beginner filmmakers will need to know about things like shotgun mics, monitors, RAID setups, and lighting techniques. And these aren't really things that I've seen Darius discuss. He's talked about lav mics and audio recorders, but never XLR shotgun mics exclusively. He did a video showing off his G7 rig, but he never really talked about what sort of factors went into deciding how this rig would be built. Which might seem like a small nitpick, but that information would be very useful to indie filmmakers that are trying to build rigs of their own. Different filmmakers have different styles, and thus they need to build different rigs, so just showing off how your rig is built is not really beneficial if you don't also explain why it's built that way. Now granted, you could make the argument that Darius' channel isn't really about that kind of content and that filmmakers looking for that should just go somewhere else, but I don't really see the point in making videos recommending different lights without showing off things like cookies, snoots, and other light modifiers that allow these lights to be used in different ways. This is sort of why I really like DSLR Guide and DSLR Video Shooter. Now, don't let the names fool you. While these guys have plenty of videos on DSLR shooting, since that's usually where most filmmakers start, they still cover a wide range of other filmmaking techniques that I think are very important. I particularly like DSLR Guide's video talking about his editing setup, since he covers a lot of what makes a good editing setup and where to start when it comes to making your own. DSLR Guide has a pretty even balance of videos relating to gear as well as technique, and he always stresses that having good technique is more important than having good equipment. He even did a video comparing an industry standard cinema camera with a cheap DSLR and showing the positives and negatives of shooting with both. Unfortunately, DSLR Guide doesn't upload as frequently anymore, which is understandable since he works primarily as a freelancer, and I imagine he prioritizes that work over making YouTube videos. DSLR Video Shooter uploads a bit more frequently, and he makes some of the most detailed gear review videos that I've seen on YouTube. Although he doesn't really cover technique all that much, you can find him talking about a really wide range of gear from entry level to industry standard and everything in between. He even has a series where he reviews vintage or forgotten cinema cameras and talks about how they hold up in the modern era. This is actually some of my favorite content on his channel because not only do I use a lot of the older equipment that he talks about, but filmmakers that don't have a lot of money can really benefit from knowing a lot about this vintage gear since a lot of it holds up pretty well, and knowing how to buy, sell, and trade film gear is a very useful skill to have as a beginner filmmaker. And the only way that you're going to learn is by doing research on all this old stuff, and thankfully DSLR Video Shooter makes that research a lot easier. My only complaint about his channel is that he doesn't really talk about film technique all that much, but that's not really what his channel is about, so it's not like I can get too mad at him for it. I do, however, think that the name DSLR Video Shooter is a bit misleading since he talks about way more than just DSLR filmmaking, but I imagine at this point it's far too late for him to start rebranding. Filmright is probably the most well-known filmmaking channel, and for good reason. They've been making videos for almost as long as YouTube has been around, and they seem to have covered every topic imaginable at least once. Everything from screenwriting, to camera gear, to shooting schedules, to on-set safety, to practical effects, to digital effects, and pretty much everything else you can imagine. With over 1,000 videos, Filmright has pretty much everything that you need to know how to make your first film from beginning to end. Another channel similar to this is Indie Mogul, but Indie Mogul has been on extended hiatus several times throughout the years and has changed the nature of their content almost every time they return, so there's a bit less consistency overall when it comes to their content. There's also Hurlbut Academy, which covers a wide variety of topics, but with a large emphasis on cinematography, since the channel is hosted by Shane Hurlbut, a cinematographer that's been working in the industry for over 30 years and is probably most famously known as the guy that got yelled at by Christian Bale on the set of Terminator Salvation.
What don't you get about it?
I was looking at the light.
Oh, good for you. And how was it?
Just goes to show you that no matter how high up you are, you're never above getting yelled at on set. The last few channels that I'm going to talk about are channels that I don't really like that much, and they fall under a very specific category that I'm going to refer to as influencer SEO channels, and this includes channels like Think Media and Ben Johnson. Now, before I talk about why I don't like these channels, I think it's important to try and describe what a filmmaking channel is, and here's where things get a bit tricky. All the channels that I've talked about so far are channels that just provide tips and info that will help younger filmmakers in making their first film projects. These channels, however, while they do provide things like gear reviews and filmmaking tutorials, their goal is to reach would-be influencers and internet content creators, which is an entirely different market. While channels like Film Riot and Indie Mogul will often cover industry standard gear and techniques, these channels will only cover gear and techniques that are used for creating internet content, so they never really cover topics like framing, composition, or storytelling. And they never really talk about any expensive industry standard film gear, just gear that you'd commonly see most YouTubers using. Now, you might be asking why I have a problem with these channels if they clearly have a different type of audience and intention. And the reason is because these types of channels are usually the kind that a lot of indie filmmakers wind up finding first when looking for filmmaking tutorials. This is because of how popular they are in YouTube and Google search results. Now, there really isn't anything that can be done about that since search results are based on what people want to see. However, something that I think these channels could try to do is to distinguish themselves from channels aimed at filmmakers. Some of them do a pretty good job at doing this already by making titles like Best Cameras for YouTubers or Lighting Gear for Content Creators, but others will hardly make the distinction at all, and even worse, some of them will actually use words like filmmaking and cinematography tutorials in the tags and branding. Now, there's a lot of differences between being a filmmaker and a content creator, and if you don't believe me, just compare some of the videos made by the filmmaking channels that I mentioned to the ones made by these guys. DSLR Guide made this video to explain all the different artistic elements of filmmaking and how to use them in tangent with each other to make your final product, while Think Media makes videos like how to shoot videos with your phone and how to start a YouTube channel. Being a filmmaker is more about telling a story and presenting your project as art as well as entertainment, while being an influencer is more so about marketing yourself as a creator and a persona. The gear you buy, the way you use it, and the way that you market your final product are all very different between these two industries, so younger filmmakers might actually be picking up some bad habits by watching these channels when looking for filmmaking advice. Think Media was one of the first people that I saw recommending the Panasonic G7 to indie filmmakers, so I hold him partially responsible for all the people that impulsively bought this camera only for it to be irrelevant 3 years later. There are plenty of other channels on YouTube that talk about filmmaking, but I just wanted to take some time to discuss some of my favorites, as well as some of the ones that I think that filmmakers should avoid. If there's any that you really like that I didn't mention in this video, I'd love to see you guys discuss them in the comments. I'm always trying to give back to the community by making videos that are not only entertaining, but informative to indie filmmakers, and if you think that I did a good job, then consider subscribing because there's always something new to look forward to.